Hello and welcome to Town Talk. I'm your host, Rose Highland-Sharpe. This very inspirational program is brought to you by Highland Communications for storytelling, edutainment, music, and much more. Call at 910-528-0718. Stay tuned for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Black and Blue Tour 2011 with guide Professor Tim McMillan, class of 1980. Video per yours truly, the Reverend Rose Highland-Sharpe, class of 1980 and 83, and part of the UNC Black Alumni Reunion Inspirational Service Committee. Enjoy the history of the buildings and grounds relative to African American slaves, the black citizens of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, UNC black students, and famous black literary professionals. And you'll see some fellow Carolina alumni on the tour as well. Enjoy! This show was first seen on WYBE TV3, Southern Pines, North Carolina, TownTalkTV in 2011.
Except he's up on a 50-foot column, so you can see him from everywhere. But you'll notice he points north. Civil War soldiers usually point north. But this tour actually began because I teach a first-year seminar, a freshman seminar, called Defining Blackness. And the first time I taught it was in 2001, and we were in that classroom building right there. And when we looked out the window, the first thing we saw was our Civil War soldiers. And so the whole focus of the class was, how do black people see this campus different from white people? How is it different when you come up here, you know, as a sophomore or junior in high school with your parents, and you're greeted by a Civil War soldier? White North Carolina kids, you know, they probably wear Confederate flags on their t-shirts. Black kids, and particularly their parents, you all remember when convenience stores hung Confederate flags out front if they didn't want you to come to it? That was always between, I grew up in Greenville, and when you go to the beach, you know, if you saw a Confederate flag, you knew what it meant. Well, what does it mean here? Very recently, a group of students have started what they're called like the Real Silent Sam movement. And they want to put a new plaque up on him. And what they want to put on it is some of the dedication speech that was given in 1914 when he was erected. The person who gave the dedication speech for this statue was Julian Carr, the man who Carrboro is named after. If you go to Durham, there's the Carr building. He was a big industrialist back in the 1870s and 1880s. When he gave his speech about this, he talked about the boys who died for Anglo-Saxon society to exist. So he's very clearly a monument to white supremacy. And there's always the people who say, well, you know, it's heritage. Hey, let's not destroy the past. And now people are saying, well, we don't want to destroy it, but let's not forget what it was really about at that time. So he sparked a lot of discussion. One of the discussions he sparked, good morning, how are you? Thank you for coming out on this chilly day. One of the conversations that he sparked was the development of this statue. I was just saying, I started this tour with a class from 2001, and this statue goes back to that class. The class of 2002, which were seniors at the beginning of 2001, was asked by the university to think about a monument to the people who built this campus. But it was sort of controversial because, of course, they were the class that was most directly affected by September 11th. Right, 2 weeks into their last year in college, the Twin Towers came down and a number of Carolina people died. And that class really wanted to put up a memorial to the people who were harmed in September 11th because it was very personal to them. But the university, because of the controversy over Silent Sam, and because for our bicentennial, right, remember we started in 1793, our first student came in 1795, the university for the bicentennial created a new award to celebrate women on campus. The problem is who they named the award after. It was called the Spencer Bell Award. Cornelia Phillips Spencer, who Spencer Dorm is named after, was a major advocate for women's education. She helped, there's a dorm named after her at Greensboro Women's College, but she was also a white supremacist. She believed in Anglo-Saxon society, just like Julian Carr. And so a group of students and activists got together and petitioned the chancellor to get rid of the Spencer Bell Award. They said it was offensive to remember women as a group with somebody who looked at blacks as a group as inferior. And the university did. We changed the name of the award. It's now the Women's Award. But part of that discussion was to remember black people on this campus because they had been forgotten for so long. And that's where the statue came from. But it's a statue. That's what everybody thinks. It's a table that it was created to be a table, and part of the reason was expense. A lot of people say, look how big Silent Sam is, look how real he is. If you go, and read the plaque, it remembers the people who fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. If you go to Memorial Hall, do you all remember when you would go to Memorial Hall? All those plaques list every single person. There's no plaque that remembers the people here. So what I think is really interesting about this one is it doesn't use the word slave, even though everybody knows it's the monument to the slaves who built the campus. In fact, as the kids are reading, it says, people of color bond and free. How many Asians, how many Latinos, how many Native Americans built this campus in 1793? So people of color, it's like the whole idea of affirmative action a lot of people look at as reparations, except the people that it repaired the most were white women. Well, this is remembering people by forgetting who it actually was. It says people of color bond and free. Bond, there are a lot of people who are bound and not slaves. But my biggest problem with it is it says we. The we in the statue is the same as the we in the Constitution. And it's a we that forgets the people that it's trying to remember. Because I'm sure a lot of you remember from your days here, there was always kind of a divide between Black UNC and Black Chapel Hill. The people who lived back in North Side and Pine Tops and Tin Top. There's a lot of people who work on this campus live in the black neighborhoods of Chapel Hill, and most of them, at least in the 70s and 80s, were the descendants of the people who built this campus, and they knew the names of the people who built this campus. It's not that we forgot them, it's that white UNC forgot them. And this is, a way of trying to make up for that. But there have been more protests about this statue in the last 10 years than there have been about Silent Sam, about people talking about midgetizing and minimizing and people standing on top of it. Let's come on over here and look at a monument. The thing, put up a monument to it. Right? If you want to hide something, put it in a public place. Like I think Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story like that, where the one place you don't look is right in front of you. Well, I was a student here. I came in '77. I stayed here as a student until '88, and then I've been teaching here on and off ever since then. And I must say, for most of that history, I had no idea what this was. I took a lot of my classes in alumni. I worked in alumni. I walked past here. It's got written on it what it is. But this is our Washington Monument at UNC. The first president of UNC is buried right under here. And his wife and her son. So this is, and I always think that's interesting when I see people making out on it. Until we put up the Unsung Founders Monument, there was no place to sit here except the Davy Poplar. So people are sitting here drinking a beer, making out, and I think, you know where you're doing that. There's people under here who might or might not object. But this is the monument to the first president of the university. And it's really important because this is actually the second monument to Joseph Caldwell. first one was over by New West, and he was actually dug up and moved here. We did a lot of that on this campus. He was actually dug up the first time to make a mask of his face, because this was before photography, so they made death masks of people. So they dug him up, made a mask, buried him, dug him up, and moved him here. If any of you lived in Spencer Dorm, President Swain, who was the president after him, was buried behind there. He was dug up and moved to Raleigh, to Oakwood Cemetery. But so you never know who was lurking here. But this is the second monument. This one is made out of marble. The first one was made out of sandstone, and it's not as fancy. Or this one's made out of granite. The reason that it's important is at the end of this tour, you're going to see the one that was originally here, over Joseph Caldwell. Now it's over Wilson Caldwell, who was the son of his slave. So there's the same monument was over the president of the university and over a man who was enslaved on this campus. And the connection is kind of important. So Joseph Caldwell, if we read the far side of this, came here from New Jersey in 1795. New Jersey was not much of a slave state in those days. When he moved here, the first thing he did was bought slaves. Right, that's how Southern gentlemen became Southern gentlemen. He also married Helen Hogg Hooper and who was wealthy and acquired more people that way. One of the people he bought was a man named November, and he was very famous. If you study the campus history, November Caldwell was a really famous man. He was the coachman for President Caldwell, but he also carried firewood, which I think we probably all like some of right now, for the students. He carried water, he blacked their shoes. He was a college slave. We like to call them college servants because it sounds nicer, but I think that using the word slave is important if you're talking about people who are being treated as property, because otherwise you lose that reality. They knew they were people, but they weren't usually treated as people, and that is what this illustrates. November Caldwell was Joseph Caldwell's property. He lived where the current president's house is. He was the coachman, so he lived in the carriage house. When Joseph Caldwell died, his wife kept the house because she actually owned it. So the new president, President Swain, had to build a house next door. He moved in. He was a former governor of North Carolina. He owned a lot of people, and he brought some of them with him. You know where the Arboretum was an area where a lot of enslaved people on this campus lived. One of the people he brought with him was a woman named Rosa Burgess. She was attending to his wife and his daughter. Rosa fell in love with November. Did they get legally married? No, because they were slaves. You couldn't legally marry. But they engaged in a relationship and had a son. Here's your pop quiz. What was that son's last name? Rosa Burgess and November Caldwell have a child. What's his last name?
Swain.
Swain. Very good. That was a good guess. But why would it be Swain and not Caldwell? Who was Swain in the story?
The owner of Burgess.
The owner of this little boy's mother. Under the law of North Carolina, if your mother, whoever owns your mother, owns you. Right, today usually you think your father is the person you usually get your last name from. But in those days, that was true, unless you were legally property. So this little boy, for the first 20 years of his life, was Wilson Swain. But you remember I said it's the Caldwell Monument? After the Civil War ended, he wanted to remember his father. So a lot of black people did this in those days. After the end of the Civil War, when slavery ended, they took on a name that they believed represented themselves. And he wanted to be related to his father. So of course you've got the gender issue. Right? What's wrong with his mother? He could have become Burgess. But that's the reality of 1865. But so there's two Caldwell monuments. And what I always like to point out is we here in Chapel Hill think we're exceptional. right? The Carolina way, the Carolina spirit. But in terms of slavery, we were exactly like Alabama or Georgia or Maryland or Virginia. We were no better and we were no worse. And before we move on, I mentioned that if you were where the Arboretum is, you'd find a lot of President Swain's enslaved people. In fact, if you were on this campus in the 1800s, you would have seen more black people per capita, more black people as a percentage of the population than you do today. And that's because if you were a student here in 1830, your tuition was $1 a semester. But you paid $2 a semester as a slave fee, because slaves took care of your needs. They emptied your toilet bucket. They brought you water. All of the people who took care of you as a student here were rented from someone else. The university didn't own any slaves itself. It rented them from President Swain, from President Caldwell, and from Professor Elijah Mitchell. Elijah Mitchell lived in this little house, which is where Swain Hall is now, right over there. At any one time, there were 20 to 40 enslaved people living in the yard of this house. Over where New East is, was the university's steward's house. And at any time, there were 20 to 40 enslaved people there. So between President Swain's slaves the university was renting, and the slaves of Professor Mitchell, there might be 70 enslaved people just in this area, not to mention the people who lived on Franklin Street, right, who were the property of the merchants. So this is actually...
That's a real breeze. That's very nice.
I talk about it in class and people don't get it. But primarily white institution. We're the first white institution to name a dormitory or any building after a slave. And we made a big deal about that. We had press releases where we talked about, we are the first white institution to name a dorm after a slave. Well, of course, the enslaved person we named a dorm after was George Moses Horton. Part of my research is how we said that, by the way. A lot of our press releases said exactly what I said, that we were the first white university to name a dorm after a slave. But we didn't say who we named it after, because that wasn't the important piece. It's that a white university named something after a black person. You know, it's sort of like when you appoint somebody to a job and say, and we appointed a black person to that job. We don't care who it was as long as we can say that and put their picture in public. So the reason I say that, and the reason that ties to this chapel story, is the story of George Moses Horton we tell on this campus is not the true story. We have changed his history to make him fit what we want UNC to be today. George Moses Horton was a slave. He lived in Chatham County, out where Farrington Village is now, and he used to walk to Chapel Hill 8 miles every Friday and walk back to Chatham County 8 miles every Sunday. Why do you think he came to Chapel Hill?
As a professor?
No. Oh, good guess. See, you live in the 21st century. Very good guess, but no, not in 1830. He came here because, well, if you were a slave, what would you want more than anything else?
Freedom.
Freedom, right? You would want to not be a slave. Well, how do you get to not be a slave?
Go to the north.
Well, yes, you go to the north. How do you get to the north?
You have to.
If you were a slave and you tried to go to the north, do you think that other people would be, most of the people in North Carolina would be happy about that? No, because most of the people in North Carolina were what?
White.
White, and a lot of them were slave owners. So if you wanted to get out of slavery and you couldn't run away, right? And that's, a lot of people did try to run away, and some were successful. But how could you get out of slavery legally? You had to work your way out, pay your way out, buy your freedom. That was really hard. In North Carolina, we were different than a lot of other states. If you owned somebody and you wanted to free them, right? Because you're a nice guy and you say slavery is bad. In North Carolina, you didn't have that right to free somebody that you yourself owned. Only the government of North Carolina could free them. The whole state legislature had to vote to free one person. So it's very hard to become free here. But lots of people tried. Well, what do you think you needed to be free? Money. So George Moses Horton paid his owner a quarter every week to be allowed to come to Chapel Hill to try to earn money so that he'd have enough money to be free, right? I mean, he was really hopeful. He started doing this when he was about 25 years old. And he'd come to Chapel Hill every weekend and do little jobs for the students, like Caldwell, the president. We know that Caldwell paid him $1 to do some work for him. But you know, this is where the story gets a little adult, so be careful. If you're a slave and you can't be free, you're probably not real happy most of the time, right? I mean, who's going to be happy to be owned, and who's going to be happy to be sold and mistreated? Some people, when they're unhappy, drink alcohol. And the students liked to give alcohol to some of the slaves because they liked to see what they would do. They were picking on them. They were bullying them. They would give them alcohol and then make fun of them. And George Moses Horton was one of those people that the students would give liquor to and then laugh at him. What makes Horton so amazing is that, unlike a lot of people, he realized what was going on and he decided to stop drinking. But he decided to keep talking and see if he could get the students to pay him to talk. Now that's extraordinary, right? You think about that, a man who's a slave turning the tables on the people who are enslaving him. And instead of letting them mock him, he sort of subtly mocked them. So what he did was, what's a way you can get paid for talking or writing? Yes?
You're one author or one of those people who make speeches?
Okay, he did both. He became an author. And what was so amazing was he became an author, but he couldn't read or write. So he gave speeches and people would write down. And the kind of things he wrote were poems. He would write poems for these rich white boys who lived here. What do you think these rich white boys wanted to do with his poems? What do you use poems for? To attract the ladies. So he wrote poems. So think about this. A man who was considered to be inferior. And these boys who were the richest boys in North Carolina, these rich young men, had one of these people they thought was inferior helping them to attract girlfriends. What does that say about who's the smart person and who's not in this story? That, I think, is the real story of George Moses. Or was he was able to turn, you know, it's like karate or judo, where you may be weaker, but you know how to use your strengths against people who look stronger. So George Moses Horton wrote poems, and he was published. He had a book of his poetry published before he learned how to read and write. There was a lady on this campus named Caroline Hentz who wrote really bad novels. There's lots of people who write really bad novels. Horton's poetry was pretty good. Her novels were very bad. But she took an interest in Horton. And she helped him read and write. She helped him get published. And she wrote a novel where he was a character. And in her novel, he was freed. Right? In her novel, she wrote a story that wasn't true. And in her story, he became a free man. At UNC right now, we give a Chancellor's Award, an award for students who do really good things, like translating from Greek and learning political science. We give one that's called the George Moses Horton Award. And when they give it, the university says, George Moses Horton was freed using the profits of his poetry. That is not true. He was freed in her novel. But in the real world, George Moses Horton became free at age 68. Well, he was born in 1797. So what happened when he was 68? I'll give you a clue. It would have been in the year 1865. What happened in 1865? He was, that is true. He was freed. The Civil War was over. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution ended slavery. George Moses Horton became free exactly the same time that 300,000 other people in North Carolina became free. Not because he was brilliant, not because he worked hard, not because he showed these white guys that he was smarter than them, but because everybody was freed. Same thing is true for Chapel Hill desegregated. If you go and talk to the pioneers here, you know, the people who came to UNC in 1955, and well, none of them graduated from UNC for obvious reasons. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But UNC, the city of Chapel Hill, everybody thinks is really liberal, right? We're very pro-Obama and anti-Bachman, right? And we're, you know, we're occupying right now in front of the post office. That's not always been true. Chapel Hill desegregated the movie theater and the gas stations and the drugstores exactly the same time they did in Greenville and in Raleigh and in all the rest of North Carolina in 1964. So the Carolina story is we are normal for a southern city. But when we talk about George Moses Horton, we try and make it sound like, you know, work hard, do your chores, don't drink, and you'll be freed, you'll be rewarded. It wasn't true here. The real message of the story is persevere. But it's kind of interesting, you know, that we just say we named a dorm after a slave because he was extraordinary. What we don't say is even an extraordinary slave gets treated just like anybody else.
Wow.
Well, let's move to the 20th century. The big ones, there was a movement to blow them up. They were going to get rid of Morrison, Hinton James, because, you know, they're big and tall and not real. They are historic, but instead they just added more. And it's kind of interesting, actually, because Hinton James was always the dorm that was the blackest dorm on campus. Herringhouse was the athlete dorm. And a lot of black people chose. You know, I mean, that was one of the issues when the university was looking at segregation on campus, is people wanted to be in a place where they didn't stick out as much. You know, if you were over here, it was kind of an issue. But the other, of course, is that Hinton James was a slave owner. So renaming a dorm that was named after a slave owner to be named after a slave is kind of an interesting thing. But so that's where it is. If you go to Hinton James, you all know where Hinton James is. Go the little dorm next to it is Horton Hall. So we've moved into the 20th century. We've crossed Cameron Avenue. Cameron, of course, was the largest slave owner in North Carolina. And I always think it's kind of interesting. For those of you who've been gone a while, you might have noticed that Airport Road is now called Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. That was actually very controversial. There was a lot of debate about that. And one of the reasons was there was already a Martin Luther King Jr. Road in Chapel Hill. And, well, it was over actually across from Lowe's, you know, but it was in a black neighborhood. And so they had to rename their road so that Chapel Hill could have this bigger one. But what I always thought was interesting is Cameron is named after people who owned 1,000 people. In North Carolina, that's weird. Most slave owners here owned 10 or fewer. They owned 1,000, and they owned them right across the Durham County line. There's a place called Stagville, which was the Cameron Benahan plantation. Cameron Avenue is where the chancellor's office is. It's where some white fraternities are. It's where some upper-class white houses are, and it's where a lower middle-class black neighborhood is, right across from the university power plant. This neighborhood was built by the university so that the employees would not be late for work. I thought this would be a great road to rename after somebody for a lot of reasons. So the chancellor's address would be on it, so that it would incorporate a black and a white neighborhood. And here's who I think we should have named it after. Martin Luther King, we've all heard of him, right? Is a great man. Nobody, well, I'd say nobody disagrees, but here probably not. Some people. But his connection to Chapel Hill is fairly small as an individual. We had the very first black student at UNC take a class in this building 15 years before Brown v. Board of Education. She was not a legal student because she couldn't, because the university was segregated. This is the old Playmakers Theater. She was a faculty member in 1939 at North Carolina College for Negroes, which is now Central. She was hired in 1939 to teach English at Central, but she wanted to study with Paul Green. Paul Green wrote The Lost Colony, the play about the beginnings of North Carolina. But he taught here, he turned folklore into plays, and she wanted to learn from him. Who do you think she was? Zora Neale Hurston.
How about that?
Who hasn't heard of Zora Neale Hurston? Now, and who has a road named after her? Think about that, Zora Neale Hurston Boulevard. I would have been all over that. Because she was here for a year. She actually didn't take classes here very long because the students were almost all young white men. And they didn't, you know, you said George Moses Horton came here as a professor. That would have been nice. These young white men could not stand seeing an adult black woman as an equal to themselves. As a maid, as a housekeeper, as a cook, fine. But as an intellectual, no way. So people taunted her, and Paul Green moved the class off campus to his house. A couple years later, though, Richard Wright, who some of you may have heard of, a famous author, was working with Paul Green, and he was on campus. Green got into some trouble locally, but you know, he did what he could. So Paul Green was a pretty good guy. So think about that for future projects, Hurston Way. The more direct connection is here. If you were an undergraduate at this building, university, Steele Hall was advising, right? Everybody went and saw their advisor here. If you were one of the pioneers, though, this was your dormitory. The third floor of Steele Building on the north side, those windows you see right up there, those were where all of the first black students at UNC lived. We desegregated, but we didn't integrate. So that was the segregated section of the dormitories. And what's interesting is, I've got a lot of friends who are advisors, none of them know this. We don't teach that piece of history. And I think that would be really interesting when you come in, you know, I need to drop my psych class. And by the way, this building only 50 years ago was the segregated part of campus. These first guys, they were all men, right? There were the 4 law students, a medical student came in 50, 51, and then the first 3 undergrads came in 55. If you've been around Chapel Hill, you'll know the first 3 guys, John Brandon and Leroy and Ralph Frazier, they were the first 3 black undergraduate students. They came in 55. They all came back to campus this year for the very first time since 1958. None of them graduated from UNC because of the way they were treated. In addition to being segregated up here, they also got athletic passes. Now, do you remember athletic passes? I'm sure that some of you do. You know, where you got the piece of paper and they would punch it out because they moved on to the more modern system more recently. But we had an athletic pass. Those guys had athletic passes that were stamped colored. There were 3 of them. 3 black students on campus, and they stamped their passes colored like nobody could tell otherwise. Right? These were not, if you've seen their pictures, they were not people who would pass for white. So obviously the university was taunting them. You have to live separate lives, you have to be marked as black. And the reason they had the athletic passes stamped colored was they were not allowed to sit in the student section. They had to sit with the staff who were in the end zones. So I think this is, I mean, this is modern. This is,
What is this?
This is the unsung, this is the student body statue, a gift of the class of 1985 that was erected in 1990.
Something's wrong. Okay. So what's wrong with it?
And what do you think this might have been for?
Water?
Standing there?
Yes,
Oh,
there's
that's
something
different.
missing. Remember I was talking about how we like to change the past to make the present look better? Well, this is one of the best examples of this on campus, and this is after most of our time here on campus. This is a statue called the Student Body. It was commissioned, well, do you notice what a lot of the figures are carrying? Books. If it's got a lot of books, what building do you think it might be connected to? A library. Is there a library here? No. The statue didn't start out here. The statue started out in front of Davis Library. Davis is our big research library. We were really proud, to add to Wilson, to the undergrad. It was decided by the university that we needed to celebrate our library and the gift of Walter Royal Davis. He really did do a lot. He gave money for the library, and then the first year it was open, there was no money to buy books. So his family donated money to buy some new books too. So the statue was commissioned to represent the student body and to show the importance of books. Apparently, the people who chose it never saw what it was going to look like, because there were a couple of problems almost immediately. She, the woman at the end, was kind of controversial, right? This white lady is having a white man read her a book. This woman is carrying her own books. That guy has his depressed look in his book bag. What's the black woman doing with her book? Learning how to be a supermodel. Right? She's showing poise, but it doesn't really demonstrate intellectual use of a book. Well, that should lead you into who's missing.
Black male.
Where is the vanishing black man?
Oh my
So,
Lord.
I do think it's kind of symbolic of that, which is
lovely.
kind of nice at one level to raise that question. But why do you think the black man is not here?
Something wrong, controversial.
There was
about
something
him.
wrong with his portrayal. Now, people also didn't like, you see how the white guy's got his hand on the woman's butt, how she is tempting him with an apple, how she's wearing a wedding ring and he's not. All of that kind of stuff, about stereotypes. Well, if you were going to stereotype a black man on this campus in 1990, what might you have him doing? He would have been an athlete. He has, what do you think he's got on his finger?
Basketball.
A basketball.
Spin it.
Let me show you the original. You can pass that around. The black man with the basketball on his finger and the book under his hand. The other person who's missing is the Asian woman, right? That's the one ethnic group that you might have expected to see here. You'll see she's carrying a violin. And not a book at all, because she probably already read it before she got out to her violin lesson. But, if this statue had been called Stereotypes, it wouldn't have been nearly as frightening. But it was called the Student Body, and the artist who did it, her name was Susan Bach, said she didn't intend to stereotype. She was showing the real world. And some people, and it opened this huge debate about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. A lot of people have said, and when I teach about this in my classes, a lot of the white students say, well, he was probably Michael Jordan. And I say, well, if he was Michael Jordan, who is she? And who are they? And who is she? Why does the one black person have to be somebody specific and all the rest are representative? I don't believe it. the artist said he was supposed to represent the balance that athletes have to have. And the response was, well, why did he have to be a black athlete? Do white athletes not have to balance in their lives either? But anyhow, we'll see this started out. The reason it was so controversial is it was right in front of Davis Library, Lenore Hall, the Student Union, and the Student Store. There was no way you could cross campus and not see it. And you probably weren't here in that era, but in 1990 there were big debates going on about the Stone Center. Sonia Stone died the next year. And it just raised all of this controversy. Well, when you're done with it, let me show you what happened. This was originally, we'll see, in front of the library, and then immediately, the black student movement had one of the best protests I've ever encountered. They had a study-in. They got members of the BSM to get their textbooks and sit around the statue and read books so that there would be images in the minds of people who went by that it's not just balancing basketballs and books. Another group, which was mostly white, was created called Chaos, Community Against Offensive Statues. It's been one of my favorite groups ever. I just love the name. The Black Ink, as part of the BSM, took on the issues of images and stereotypes, right? They show a bunch of black women with books on their heads walking around a black van doing that. And then the more direct action occurred over Christmas break, when he was knocked over and his basketball was stolen. So at that point, this was over Christmas break. The statue was taken down, he was sent and recast. So, I mean, we paid the money to fix him. And the chancellor and a committee got together, and actually the chancellor took advice that the committee didn't give and said, let's hide it here. The committee wanted to put it next to the art building and make it a discussion of how art works and doesn't work. The chairperson of the art department said, no way, you're not putting this near our building. We don't want that controversy. So it was decided to be hidden. If any of you remember this courtyard from the olden days, these shrubs were like 10 feet tall. It's only in the last 2 years that the groundskeepers have been keeping them short, in part to expose the statue. Hear me. This is where the statue originally was. I think you were trying to figure out how the statue went together. So look. Because Chase was torn down a couple years ago as part of these new dorms being built. The Upendo is now in the Student Services building, and it's very, very different. I mean, the whole, I used to go to some of the BSM movement, BSM meetings when it was in Chase, and there was, it was the Black Student Union. There was a big movement to keep it. But basically all it is a big meeting room with some newspaper articles from the old days about some of the struggles. But that issue of a meeting place and a place for black people on campus culturally is still one that people talk about. Unfortunately, some of you may have been to the Stone Center, which was begun in 2001 as a physical building and finished in 2004. It hasn't quite become the center of black life on campus that people were hoping it would be, and a lot of that was for economic reasons. If you've been in the Stone Center Theater, it's a really nice space, but the seats are like flying. I was sitting in there, and I'm not particularly big, and I was feeling constrained. So I asked the director why that was, and he said it's because they didn't have the money to finish the building, and the university would pay for it if it could serve as a classroom. And to serve as a classroom, they have to have a certain number of seats. So they had wanted to have, nice, cushy theater seats, but they ended up with basically classroom seats. So there's still that compromise that we've had to deal with. There's also, of course, the political issue of where the Stone Center ended up being sited. A lot of people wanted it to be on main campus and not across the road, and particularly not right next to the football stadium, you know, because there's always, like with our basketball player. So even though we're in 2011, a lot of issues are still up for discussion. But where we're going to go, well, a couple things I just wanted to point out in case you didn't know them. For those of you who are new here, the student stores, a lot of students, you know, we talked about Silent Sam and the controversy with him. A lot of students have complained about the names of the buildings, because some of these buildings, like Hinton James, are named after slave owners. Some of them, like Saunders Hall, he was the head of the KKK in North Carolina. And so it's, you know, do you really want to be studying geography, but thinking the guy this building is named after really would prefer that we not be here? The student stores, right, which everybody goes to because you have to buy your Carolina Blue memorabilia, is named after a man named Josephus Daniels. Daniels was the editor of the News and Observer, the North Carolina big newspaper. He was also one of the leading white supremacists of the state. And in 1898 was one of the leaders in the riot that knocked black people out of political power in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so I think there's a little historic triangle there with the student stores being named after somebody particularly bad and nobody being able to avoid it. I'd also like to mention Lenore Hall. We talked, that was the place where the black student movement had its first major political action. Well, it's second actually. The department I teach in was in many ways created because the black student movement said we needed a Department of African and African American Studies. And we still are. We are unusual. Very few universities combine Africa and black Americans in the same department. And there's been a lot of movement to push us apart. And we have argued that this was the original intent of the original students. And that can, you know, because in the 60s, people were connected Africa and black America much more than people do now. But so we came out of that original document. And the first real action was working in behalf of the black women who were the servers in the cafeteria and being treated unfairly under the labor laws of the state. They would work 5 months and 30 days and then be fired, so they wouldn't fall and then rehired 2 days later. They would be made to work split shifts, so they couldn't work another job which they needed. You know, you'd have to be here, but you'd have to be back 3 hours later, but you didn't get paid for the other 3. 2 women named Elizabeth Brooks and Mary Smith, 2 local black Chapel Hill women, well, Orange County actually, I think it's from Hillsborough. See, we always claim everything good and pretend other people. But they, with the black student movement, helped lead a strike where they set up a separate cafeteria to try to force the issue of labor rights for the majority of black people on this campus who were not students. Right? There were less than 100 black students on campus at the time. But in the hospital, in the cafeteria, in housekeeping, black people were dominant. This was 1969 and 1970. There were actually 2 strikes. And what I think is so amazing is Mary Smith negotiated with the governor, and they actually ended up winning some rights. Now, unfortunately, what happened is exactly what's happened in the modern era. They privatized the system so they no longer had to fall under state rules. But there's been a movement to memorialize Mary Smith and Elizabeth Brooks in the cafeteria to put up a mural or a plaque, and that still hasn't happened. And I was talking about this a couple of days ago. We can make a monument to the slaves who built this campus, even if we can't call them slaves. But we can't talk about people from our recent past who are dealing with issues that we're still struggling with. For those of you who aren't around, I think it was last year we had a big issue where a housekeeper in South Campus was taking her break in the lounge, and her supervisor said, and the university upheld this, you could not take a break in the presence of students. They have little closets, basically, that they had to do their breaks in places out of view of students. And the psychology of that and what that's saying about you as a person is just very problematic. And it's the same issue we had 40 years ago and the same issue we had 200 years ago. Are these members of our community, or are they basically property to make sure that the people who matter, the students, the staff, and the students and the faculty, are able to thrive and function? And I think that's why it's easier to talk about slaves and, being a brilliant poet than it is about some of these other issues. But Lenore Hall, and that's, I think, why this statue was so offensive, is that this was happening right across from places where black people were trying to be something other than a stereotype of a supermodel or everything from here this is where black people are buried with half of one exception. I'll tell you who he is. And then everybody on the other side is probably white. You never know for sure, but probably. But why this is important, this new wall? This was put in for a couple of reasons. One was this parking deck. A lot of people were objecting to putting in this big parking deck, to having this chiller plant and all that. And one of the groups that objected was the Gimgul people. The Gimgul neighborhood is right across here. The Gimgul was an upper class, mostly white neighborhood who didn't want all this traffic spilling out. So they got concessions. Since they got concessions, a group of people from North Side decided they would also say, well, this is going to affect our side of the graveyard, which is true. And you've been neglecting the graveyard, which is true. So the city and the university gave $50,000 to do some renovation. But this was a particularly sore topic. Was anybody here in '86? Yes, sir.
Why is it kind of black and white?
Well, that's a long story, but what in the graveyard, because segregated in life, segregated in death. So this is a physical representation of what you've studied about segregation, where there were separate bathrooms for black people and white people. It's kind of interesting, though. I was just in a talk yesterday or the day before.
Charles Perrault.
Some slave owners.
On the other side.
Other side of this.
Yeah. So that's the theater right there. So,
So that they would call
tennis court.
Okay.
Or they might have some
what was they didn't realize that football Saturday with this wall missing and nobody being able to find parking, the number of people parked their cars here in the black section of the graveyard because the wall had not fallen down on the right side because people the city owns the graveyard. So the city doesn't make it. But the city was not maintaining the black side of things for the white. And so all these cars were parked in here. And I don't think, people are saying, oh, I don't park my car on your grandma because I hate black people. But that's how it looked. And nobody wants, their family desecrated. And so that, in 1986, is what really led to the movement to pay attention to this section of the graveyard. And that has persisted up until today. About 6-7 months ago, a study was done. Let's go over and look at that. See how empty it looks? This is the area where people were parked. Because it wasn't like they were knocking over gravestones. But they were parking here, and in the last 6 months or so, the Chapel Hill Preservation Society brought in an archaeological firm to start looking to figure out how many people are actually here. Because before the end of the Civil War, as I said, enslaved people didn't get a marker. So probably the stones in these walls and some of the stones in the buildings are actually the gravestones. There's probably, the best estimate is that in this area, there's about 1,000 people. If you look at the old section of the white part, it's about the same. And I think that's really important, is it shows Chapel Hill was about, it wasn't quite half and half, but it was pretty flat. And we do tend to forget that. Now, a very modern thing, the 2010 census, for the very first time in Chapel Hill, black people are no longer the majority minority. Asians are now outnumbering black people in Chapel Hill, and that pattern is seen to persist. Chapel Hill's always been very proud of its black political participation. You know, Howard Lee being the first black mayor of a white southern town. We've had black members of the town council going back to the 60s. There's now a political discussion among some Asian groups saying, well, you know, where's our seat? And so the politics of Chapel Hill in terms of race in the 21st century are getting very, very interesting. And they're being mirrored at the university as well in terms of what groups are rising and which are falling. So it's just something to think about. You'll see these are the stones that the Unsung Founders Monument is supposed to have as its stools, just these little rocks. If you see over there, I'm not going to make us walk over there, but you see that big fat pine tree that's right in front of the wall? And then right to the right of it is kind of a squat gray stone, kind of with the roots behind it. That's the only marker in this whole graveyard that has the word slave on it. The woman buried there is named Ilse Craig, and she was the slave in Cornelia Phillips Spencer's house. Remember Cornelia Phillips Spencer and the award. If you know where the Tri-Delt house is, if you know where the president's house is, the Spencers owned that whole side of the street, of Franklin Street. But that's the only marker that uses slave and not servant, including the Unsung Founders Monument, which I think is kind of important. He wanted to desegregate this graveyard.
Yeah.
And so half of him is
ashes
sprinkled here and the other
of
half
white
is in Chapel
activists.
Hill.
And
Union
here
Park
we go.
across from University.
Last destination for this African American black and blue tour.
These are two well known. We were just up by McDade, Craig, Battle. All the names that you see with white Chapel Hill were also the names with black Chapel Hill. And I do find it disturbing that that monument is celebrating the fact that we don't know who these people are, when in fact all you'd have to do is go to the library and you could find out who a lot of people were. You know, to Confederates, it's very important to know who died and where they died. For this monument, you know, it's this generality. I just find that to be a problem. But anyhow, here's a very specific monument. This is the monument where Wilson Swain Caldwell is buried. He's buried under it. If you go to the front side, it also mentions the name of his father, November, and of two other men on this campus. It's a very specific monument, and it was the gift of the class of 1891. So we've seen three class gifts. The Unsung Founders, the class of 2002. The beautiful student body was the class of 1985. And this was the class of 1891. Wilson Swain Caldwell, remember, was born behind where Spencer Dormitory is. He worked as a university slave as a child. He was a groundsman and then he was a waiter. He waited on students. As soon as the Civil War was over in 1865, he became a paid employee of the university. He worked here. He was made it wasn't the sheriff, but it was the magistrate of Chapel Hill. Very early on during Reconstruction, he was elected to the Board of Selectmen in Chapel Hill. So Wilson Swain Caldwell went from slavery to freedom and made the transition very well. When he died, he owned 12 acres of property in Chapel Hill. Like many people, he rented property to students. So he made a lot of money. He was quite well respected, and in a strange twist, Julian Carr, the man who talked about Anglo-Saxon culture at the Silent Sam dedication, was one of the people who spoke at his funeral. As was President Battle, the man that Battle Hall is named after. So Wilson did quite well. But you will notice his wife is not buried anywhere near him, nor his children. In fact, 3 of his children are buried, go down here, right in front of me, the one that's to the left of the big stone, says Dr. Edwin Caldwell. This kind of surprised me. I went and looked at the, in 1870, that's the first census that most black people show up in as a person. In the 1860, 1850, 1840 census, there was a slave roster, a slave register, but it didn't list your name. It listed how old you were, whether you were a man or a woman, all those details, but not who you were. In 1870, you were a citizen and a person, so you were named. Edwin Caldwell was 2 and 3/4 years old in 1870. I looked at the census records, and his name in 1870 was Dr. Edwin Caldwell. That's a 2.5-year-old boy. I thought, now that's interesting. How did they know? Well, his grandfather, November, was nicknamed Doc because he was owned by the university president. That was what the students called him. So his first name, he was actually named Dr. Edwin. Well, what do you think he did? He became one of the first black physicians in North Carolina. Edwin Caldwell went to the Leonard Medical School. You ever heard of that? The Leonard Medical School was the first 4-year medical school in the country. And it was for black people, and it was at Shaw. It was set up as separate but equal, right? Because black doctors were needed because whites didn't want to have to take care of black people. But it failed fairly quickly. So there were only, I think, 12 or 15 graduating classes. But Edwin Caldwell, whose father was a slave, was able to become a physician. He lived in Durham, right? There's a pattern that has not changed where black people would move from Chapel Hill to Durham because of the cultural life and a more equal society. He shows the possibilities of Reconstruction, right? What a lot of people hoped would happen. His son, Edwin Caldwell Jr., was born during Jim Crow. And this is a picture of Wilson Caldwell doing his job as a university servant. This is after he was free. This is on South Building. His grandson, Edwin Jr., born in Jim Crow, I found in our yearbook, the Yakety Yak. You remember that? Mm-hmm. Edwin Caldwell is right here. Edwin Caldwell Jr. became the houseboy of the Deke fraternity. The fraternity right across from the Carolina Inn. That was the only job he could get to be as part of the educational institution in the 1930s.
This show was first seen on WYBE TV3, Southern Pines, North Carolina, TownTalkTV in 2011. To access highlights of the UNC Black Alumni Reunion, inspirational services, Black Pioneer brunches and dinners, and the Light on the Hill program, go to Rose Highland-Sharpe YouTube channel and UNC Library Archives under Rose Highland-Sharpe Black Alumni Reunions. Thank you so much for tuning in to Town Talk. I'm Rose Highland-Sharpe, and as always, I hope you enjoy the show. And honey, remember, some way by God's grace and mercy, if you're walking the walk, you'll be on Town Talk. Take care. God bless. Town Talk airs daily at 11 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. and other times noted in the evening on WYBE TV Spectrum Cable 3, Southern Pines, North Carolina, and on Rose Highland-Sharpe YouTube 24 hours a day. It is a service to the community.